When it comes to driving for Uber and Lyft, in my opinion, rideshare drivers are the most undertipped profession in terms of the service industry, period. Way more undertipped than bartenders, servers, waiters, waitresses, even Uber Eats drivers and delivery drivers. It's very unfortunate. That being said, there are some ways to increase your chances of getting a tip when it comes to driving as you keep 100% of your tips. So in this video, I'm talking about my 7 best techniques to getting more tips when it comes to driving for Uber and Lyft. Number 1, a warning call. Now, some of these may apply to you more than others depending on how and when you drive, which we'll talk about a bit later in this video. And you can utilize these tips however you want. I guess pun intended, tips about getting tips. But this is a good starting point. Now, you do this mostly on Friday and Saturday nights, and that is a warning call. So let's say I pull up and let's say I park and I say, okay, I'm here. Or even as I'm approaching, sometimes I'll do this. Let's say it's 9, 10 p.m. on a Friday night. I'll call them saying, hey, this is Mark, your Uber driver. Just want to let you know I'm outside. Just want to give you the heads up because I know sometimes you guys are pre-gaming or getting ready. You might miss it or something like that. And I will usually try to feel this out. Now, I will say this. It can get annoying where every single time you drive to call them when you're there. But I actually find, although at first it was kind of a bit of a hassle once I started using this technique, and it actually proved to be very good for me. I will say this. I find this is way better on Friday and Saturday nights. Like at 7:30 in the morning, am I going to call somebody to let them know I'm outside? I find I don't have to do that as much. But when people are pre-gaming, getting ready, finishing their drinks, all this kind of stuff on a Friday and Saturday night, it can be very easy to miss that notification when it comes to Uber and Lyft. And I found this did 2 things. One, I found as opposed to me waiting 5 or 10 minutes, which can happen, people would be way more readily available. They'll be like, hey, you know what? Thank you so much for saying that. I didn't even notice or see that you were here. 2, as I noticed, like this happens a lot, sometimes people miss it. And then I get the ride canceled. And now I'm like, great, I get the cancellation fee, which if it's surging and everything is probably going to be a lot less. But then also 3, I find that this does allow me to get more tips because I'm almost kicking off the ride. And I'll talk about some techniques. Like some of these layer on top of them. But this is a good way, I think, to kick off the ride on a good foot. Being like, hey, this is Mark, your Uber driver. You know, I try to be very peppy, very upbeat, very, energetic. I might even use the word fun, right, if that makes sense. Again, this is definitely more for, I think, Friday and Saturday nights. But I think even still, calling ahead or just calling even when you're right there can do wonders when it comes to getting tips because it sets off the ride on a good point. Number 2, cleanliness. Now, I know this is very straightforward, very captain obvious, but I do have to mention it because besides the warning call, besides that first impression, if you think about it, the true first impression of you as a driver, your car, is how it looks on the outside. Now, in Boston, where it rains a lot, or let's say Seattle, where it rains a lot, for example, you probably don't have to worry about a car wash as much. But here in LA, for example, you definitely do. And if your car is dirty on the outside, that's the first initial impression. So let's say if you do live in an area like LA where it doesn't rain a lot, make sure your car looks good on the outside. And then, of course, I have to stress this, make sure it looks clean on the inside. Not a bad idea as well that at the end of every ride, to kind of look and say, hey, did you forget anything? Do you have your phone? This is also a big pro tip to get a good tip as well, right? Because if let's say you're like, hey, did you forget your phone? Someone's like, oh my God, I did. And I'm like, hey, no problem. Just want to check out for you. And by doing that, 1, it's a good way to finish strong, which I'll talk about a bit later in this video. But 2, you want to make sure your car is as spotless as possible. I know this is so captain obvious, but you'd be surprised, or maybe not, how many Ubers are just not clean. And in addition, by cleanliness, I'm not just talking about the visual, but also the smell, right? I think if anything, for most people, they would agree, you'd much rather be in a dirty car that smells good than vice versa, right? Especially, let's say someone just had McDonald's. If, let's say, just for whatever reason, someone wore a bunch of perfume, do whatever you can to make the smell as soothing, and that's the best word, as possible. Because I find when it comes to getting tips for Uber and Lyft, I find one big thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to learn this in psychology, I've mentioned this in a few videos, is that the lack of discomfort is comfort, not the other way around. In the sense, I know it sounds random, this is very important for this video especially. If I go into a room and it's the perfect temperature, you don't think of it. But if I go into a room and it's too cold, I'm like, oh, it's cold. If I go into a room and it's too hot, I'm like, oh, wow, it's really hot in here, right? Discomfort is the lack of comfort, not the other way around. And I find when it comes to getting tips, a lot of the times, because people tip the Uber and Lyft drivers so infrequently, that is getting better, but even still, it's very infrequent compared to a lot of other professions, like I said, especially in the service industry. One negative aspect about your ride can cause such a hinder to someone cause such a hinder for someone to tip you, which is really annoying. And that's why I say, if your car isn't that clean, if it smells a little funky, people might already be on the fence about tipping. They might just not care or whatever. And for that to be on top of that is an instant no tip. So I think if anything, when it comes to being cleanly and being clean, or it can be cleanliness and being clean, if anything, it's not necessarily about getting a better tip because your car is so clean. It's just about the fact of making it a smooth ride overall where they might have tipped you, but now it's dirty and it smells bad. And they're like, you know what? Never mind. Number 3, attire. Now, this is an interesting one because I have seen reports of some drivers who said that by dressing up nicer, they actually got more tips. I think this is especially true for anybody doing a premium ride. If you're doing Uber or Lyft XL even, which is just a step up above the regular Uber and Lyft ride, definitely dress up. Of course, if you're doing Uber Black, Uber Lux, Lyft Black, Lyft Lux, of course you kind of have to, I feel like. But even with Uber XL or Lyft XL, even just something like nice maybe black jeans and a nice button up. Like, I almost look at it like pretend like you're going to maybe not a full-on interview, but maybe like a nice family party, something like that. I do feel like that you're way better off being dressed up than dressed down. And I do kind of feel like it does set the stage. Like if someone gets in your car, you're very professional, but also nice and fun. I feel like that does kind of give off, if this makes sense, like a good energy to receive tips, right? Because I think the problem with a lot of people is when it comes to Uber and Lyft, they look at it as a very casual thing. And I say here in LA, it does depend, like say area to area. Here in LA, it's not that uncommon at all. And there's nothing wrong with that. Or wrong with this, where if I get in a car, the person's wearing just a tank top and some like cheesy sunglasses. Let me see if I don't have any here on me, but like kind of cheesy sunglasses. They almost look like a surfer bro. Now, granted, that is LA. It's almost like the culture of Los Angeles. But I feel like if, like say, someone gets in the car, you're wearing like say a nice like cliche black button up, like very professional looking and everything. Even if you're doing a normal Uber and Lyft ride, I think if you have that professionalism, people are more likely to tip. And there have been drivers who have reported that by dressing up, just kind of like acting or playing the part, can definitely do wonders. Now, one thing I want to say, I did try one time as a fun experiment, wearing an entire suit. I'm talking full-on suit, tie, everything. I found it almost threw people off. So I will say that there is a point, like if you're gonna go full out and wear a tuxedo, okay, maybe not the craziest thing, right? But I will say that, like, I think there's a point where you can almost overdo it, of course. But I think, like I said, a nice button up, just looking presentable, I think can really go a long way. Another thing is if there's anything going on, like let's say this Halloween, dressing up in a costume, right? If there's any kind of like event happening, anything that people might be dressed up as well, I think dressing up and having the right attire can really kind of go a long way when it comes to getting more tips. Number 4, interacting. Now, if you think about it, the first 3 were kind of setting the stage. You call before they even get in the car. You make sure your car is clean. In addition, you have the certain attire on. This one, I now want to talk about the ride itself. And I think there's 2 different approaches. I think for a good amount of the time, some people get in the car. Actually, a lot of people get in the car. They just go to their phone. And I think if anything, by trying to pester them and almost talk to them too much or interview them, you're almost more likely not to get a tip, right? And so I think there's a certain balance, but it's also tricky. It's almost this double-edged sword of like, okay, I know they want to be left alone, but how do I get a good tip if I leave them alone, right? Like you're not talking. So what I like to do is, and I think this comes down to really just human psychology, is reading the person. Like say they get in the car, say the formalities, like, hey, how's your day going so far? My name is Mark. I'm your driver. Nice to meet you, blah, 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 blah. You can tell pretty quick. Some people are like, hey, what's up? They start yapping. You're like, all right, they're a talker. Other people are like, hey, good morning. How are you? Right to their phone, right? Now, at this point, if, let's say, they go right to their phone, what I like to do is at least say something that sets the stage of professionalism and also just like a common understanding. So let's say someone gets in the car, go right to their phone. What I'll just say, hey, you know what? We're going to be there in 15 minutes. Let me know if you want me to adjust the AC, or the heat, or the radio. Let me know if you need anything. I'm here, and we'll be there in about 15 minutes. Thank you again for taking Uber. So say something a bit professional like that, where I'm saying, hey, I'm not going to bother you, right? Like, I kind of say that in a very, like, almost saying it in a way without saying it. Like, hey, I'm not going to bother you, but letting you know, if you need anything, I'm here. And also, I think it kind of adds to the professionalism, right, of if you need the heat, if you need the AC, if, like, say you want to roll the window down, if you want to listen to something on the radio, just let me know. I'm here in case you need anything, right? And that way, even though, like, say, we might not be talking for the entire ride, it is something that I think is a good way to kind of kick off that ride. Now, on the other end, right? On the other end, let's say I do have a car of like a bunch of people. Again, this is now more on Friday and Saturday nights. Like I find the not talking thing is more in the morning. Friday and Saturday nights, of course, people are pumped up and everything. I think this also kind of goes hand in hand with the warning call, like I said earlier. That when people get in the car on a Friday and Saturday night, I'll try to be just as upbeat. Where I'm like, hey guys, how are you not going so far? Like, and I'll kind of try to be part of the party, so to speak, and I'm very not trying to be, like intrude on them. But like, let's say they're interacting with me and talking to me, I'll make sure to kind of give them some banter. Or like say like some guys like, oh yeah, we were just having some White Claws. I'm like, oh, White Claws, really? Why not have a beer? Like, or I'll kind of joke with them and mess with them, not like as a friend per se, but like in kind of like a funny bantering way, right? And I've noticed I've gotten by far the biggest tips on Friday and Saturday nights. Then again, I will say this too. I'm naturally an extrovert, and I'm naturally very outgoing. I love meeting people. I used to be a bartender. I'm also a DJ and producer. So I feel like the energy of Friday and Saturday nights is something with me personally. Again, this is definitely a personal thing that I resonate with more. So I think that's why when I have driven on Friday and Saturday nights, I get by far the biggest amount of tips because they kind of like make it a fun, lively environment as we're driving to the club, as we're driving to the bar, as we're going to where we're going to. But again, this does come down to, I think, just like human psychology and reading the crowd and everything, reading the people, because I feel like that if you're that kind of person that really just understands what the person wants as the rider, that's, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to get a good tip. If you just understand. If you understand, like, hey, they don't be disturbed. I see something like I said, like I said earlier. If you need anything, let me know. We'll be there in 15 minutes. I can just heap of blah. Sometimes just reading that and reading the room is a good way to be like, hey, you know what? This rider respected me, or excuse me, this driver respected me, and they were there if I need anything, blah, blah, blah. But on the other end, sometimes when reading the room, I'm like, hey, if I just sit there and I'm quiet, I feel like people might not like that as much. And if anything, people are in a good mood, they're energetic, they've been consuming alcohol, they might want a fun, lively driver, right? And I think reading the room and then going off of that is a big way to help guarantee a tip. Number 5, finish strong. So if you think about it, first impressions are important, but last impressions, I think especially when it comes to a tip, are just as important. So when I get there, I'll say, hey guys, double check everything. I might turn on the lights. Let's say it's a Friday night. I'm like, make sure you don't forget your phone. You sure you have everything? You guys good? I might even make a joke like, hey, you sure you're good? Just want to make sure, like, I'll kind of like do some funny banter or whatever, because this is the last thing they remember of me. This is the last interaction they're having with me. And I'm like, hey, enjoy that bar. Let me know how it is. Like, I haven't been there yet. Or sometimes I even ask people on a Friday or Saturday night, like, hey, where are you going? Like I said, I've been there before. I'll tell them some tips. I'll be like, yeah, by the way, you got to try this one beer. Just trust me. And the guy's like, all right, I'll try that beer. Or I'll try this drink. Or I'll go check out that one thing that you mentioned, right? So I think finishing off on a really positive, upbeat, energetic note is a good kind of lasting impression for them to remember you when, like, say, they pull that up on the app to rate you and then tip you, and they might give you a higher tip or, in general, tip you, right? Because, unfortunately, as we all know as drivers, I think and this is why finishing strong is important, that I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, rideshare driving, Uber and Lyft, is the only profession that you don't really have any social pressure if you don't tip. A bartender is going to give you some flack if you don't tip them, or if you zero them, as it sometimes is called. Same thing with a waiter, waitress. Same thing with any other industry, with most industries. With Uber Eats drivers, they'll even give you some flack or get mad at you because you tip before the whole process happens, right? And with Uber and Lyft, it is so easy, too easy in my opinion, that someone can just get out of the car, leave, walk away, not tip you. No one's going to go after them. It's kind of unfortunate. Like, even a taxi driver, you tip before you get out. And I think that's the thing with Uber and Lyft is, I think for a lot of people, they look at it as an easy way to save money. With a lot of people in this economy, they just try to get out of it. And I feel like by finishing strong on a really positive point, that's the best way to go. Now, let's you have a ride, like I talked about earlier, where someone didn't really talk. They want to be with themselves. I might say something like on a very low-key note, because it is, I'll be honest, I think we all know this. There is also a balance of being positive, but also being too bubbly. Like, if you're like, hey, like, and you're too bubbly, it's almost, you're trying too hard. But let's say someone gets out of the car. We had a ride where they didn't talk. I didn't talk. I said that one line in the beginning, like I mentioned earlier. As we're getting out of the car, I would just say something like, hey, have a great day, by the way. Good luck with everything. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again for riding with me. Something like that, right? Just a very nonchalant, casual, Still positive, but not too like, hey, thank you so, like, not one of those. But I think just a good way to finish off the ride strong. So that's their last impression of me. And of course, still in the morning, just like Friday nights, I'll look back and double check to make sure they didn't leave anything. I think this is good because one, if they did, a lot of times, you probably know this, there's been so many times that someone left their phone in my car. I go to bring it to them. They don't give me anything, which is kind of annoying. I'm almost taking time out of my day. Sometimes they tip me like $20, right? Because, it is an iPhone or an Android or whatever. But again, it makes it a bit easier so you don't have to deal with that later on. But also, too, by looking back and asking them, I think it's a good positive thing. Hey, make sure you don't forget anything. Have a great day. Good way to finish strong. Number 6, tip sign. This is one that I've had a lot of drivers tell me. I never did this personally, just being honest. But I have had a lot of drivers tell me this has worked. And that is this. On the backs of the seats, so the back of the driver's seat, the back of the passenger seat, you just have a piece of paper. You can laminate it saying, something along the lines of like, tips are not required, but absolutely appreciated. And then on that, you have, let's say, your Venmo code, your Cash App, right? I think Venmo is the most common for a lot of people. That way people can tip you in different ways. Because, of course, let's say we're taking an Uber or Lyft, or let's say there's a group of people, and let's say someone could tip in the app, but also if the Venmo code is right there, it doesn't hurt. I also feel like by having a sign there, it's not that weird. I don't think it's, I'll be honest, maybe people have different perspectives on this. I don't think it's super pushy. Like, it's almost a subtle way of saying, hey, don't forget to tip your driver, but you're not saying it verbally, which I feel like is a bit aggressive. I'll talk about that on the next point. But I think when it comes to this, one, I do like that line. Tips are not required, but definitely appreciated. And then 2, giving people other options to tip. Like I said, Venmo, Cash App, Zelle, all those different options, because you never know. Maybe someone in the backs has been really loving you as a driver, and their friend is the one that got the Uber, and they're like, hey, you know what? I'll Venmo them $5. Like, why not type thing. And in addition, I think it just kind of keeps it on their mind, again, without you putting it super, super out in the open. And again, this takes 2 seconds to make like a piece of paper on it, put like some graphics on it, print it out, laminate it just so it doesn't get too dirty, hang it off the back. Don't mention it. Don't mention it all verbally, but just kind of have it there as a good way to get more tips. Number 7, talking about it. I want to mention this, that tipping culture right now, as we all know, is a bit aggressive. Excuse me, very aggressive. Let me say that. I went to a concert recently and the door person wanted me to tip them, right? I bought a gift card recently and they asked for a tip. I'm like, what? I just went in here to buy a gift card for my roommates. Like, so tipping culture has gotten aggressive. Then again, like I said, ride drivers are the most under-tipped people in the service industry, period, in my opinion. I think what's tricky, though, is if tips do come up, you want to be kind of careful. I have had drivers say things to me that, I'm not going to lie, for me, kind of turn me off. Because, for example, one time, I remember here in LA, just to use an example, I ordered an Uber. It was like peak traffic time. The worst time you can order an Uber. It was like a 45-minute drive as well. No highway. So it was like back roads, stoplight after traffic jam, after bumper to bumper. It was one of those rides, right? It was going across LA, worst ride, right? And I said to the guy about halfway through, like, hey, man, thank you for doing this ride. Just in general, like, I used to drive for Lyft and Uber. I just want to say thank you for doing this ride and everything because I know there's a lot of traffic right now. And he kind of in like a frustrating way said, yeah, man, I'm not going to lie. This ride isn't the easiest ride, but you're going to give me a good tip, so I appreciate it. And he said that in like a very aggressive way, almost exactly like the way I worded it, and I didn't tip him. I hate to say, I'll be honest, I did not tip him because, and I've had this happen before, where like say at the end of a ride, a driver says like, hey, don't forget to tip, thank you. And I'm like, and I feel like it's the same thing for me. When I used to bartend, I never said that to people. When I used to be a driver, I would never say to people, hey, don't forget to tip. And I think that's one thing to say, that when I talked before about the tip signs, it kind of says it without saying it. Because I'm going to be honest, at least for me, I think if you get too aggressive about people tipping you, not the best. Like there's been some times where, let's say I've been in Uber where they have the tip sign, and at the end of the ride, the guy goes, hey, and he points to it, basically saying like, hey, don't forget, tip me. And I do get it, because drivers do not get tipped enough as they should. But to me, it's like, I was going to tip you, but now I almost don't want to because of the pushiness. Now, I will say this. A lot of times, I will say every driver's experienced this, where someone says something along the lines of, hey, man, I can tip you in the app, right? And the driver, as a driver, you're like, yeah, you can. Or someone says, hey, man, thank you so much for the ride. I'll tip you in the app. And you're like, okay, right? Because let's be honest. So many people say that, right? So many people say, hey, I'm going to tip you in the app, and they never do. And in that instance, I do think that it does give you some ability to kind of say something. And in that case, if let's say someone does bring it up, which surprisingly a lot of people do, I think maybe they try to do it in a way to make it seem better. I don't know, but I think what I've noticed, a lot of people when getting out of the car will be like, hey, I'll tip you in the app, right? Like that's a big thing a lot of people say, is I'll usually say something like, hey man, I really appreciate that. You know, like you'd be surprised how many people don't tip. Again, it's not required, but it's absolutely appreciated. That means a lot. Thank you so much. So kind of say something like that, where I'm being honest. I'm not trying to be manipulative or sneaky or pushy, but I'm just being honest. Like, hey man, people don't tip. Most people don't, which is true. I really appreciate it. Tips are not required. Of course, tips are not required, but it really helps a lot. Thank you so much. So kind of say something like that if someone does say something, because I think if someone does open up the tipping conversation, like say that someone does open up that Pandora's box by saying, hey, I can tip you on the app, or I'm going to tip you, then I do think you should mention something. And I think that's a good line to be like, hey, you know what? I really appreciate that. Not a lot of people tip, but they're not required, but it's absolutely appreciated. Really, that means a lot. Thank you so much. Have a good night. And now a bonus tip about getting more tips is driving a Tesla. I hesitated putting this on this video, but I do want to mention because I've done a bunch of videos about driving a Tesla. Basically, to word it simply, because I've already gone very in-depth about this topic, that driving a Tesla has been shown by a lot of people that you make way more money compared to driving a normal car. There's a few different reasons. You can do, like, say, more expensive rides like XLs, or sometimes even they qualify for Uber Black or whatever. But I think the biggest one overall is the fact that when you look into a lot of the data, a lot of people say they get way more tips driving a Tesla than a normal vehicle. Now, I know for a lot of people watching this video, you're like, Mark, I'm not going to go out and buy a Tesla. I'm not going to sell my car, which I already own, and buy a Tesla. But there's been a lot of people who said, you know what, I'm going to rent one. Now, renting a Tesla, you're looking at about, I'm not exaggerating, $300 to $400 a week. So it's not cheap. I want to stress it's not cheap. But I've seen a lot of reports of people saying, hey, I drive for Uber and Lyft full time. I have my own car. But I rented a Tesla anyway. I drove with a Tesla. And even though, I'm spending $1,600 a month just to rent this Tesla, I'm making way more money at the end of the day compared to my normal vehicle. Even though I'm spending all this money when it comes to renting the vehicle, I still walk away with more money primarily because of the tips. And I've heard this a lot. But let's say in your area, I will say I do feel like this depends area to area. Like here in LA, I feel like is probably one of the biggest like Tesla hubs maybe of the country. I don't know. But I feel like here in LA, that's a big thing, especially with, green energy and electric vehicles being such a prominent thing here in LA. I think it does depend area to area, but this is something I have seen that maybe you don't know. Maybe you go out, like say, especially if you drive full time. I think if you drive part time, this probably wouldn't apply to you. But like say if you do drive full time, you drive a lot. Like you're putting in those hours, 1 hour, maybe do it for a week or two. Be like, you know what? In the name of science, I'm gonna rent that Tesla car, see what happens. Because among all these tips that I gave you about getting more tips, from what I've seen, just by having that Tesla, and of course, make sure it's clean, make sure you're professional, all these kind of things I've talked about, but just by having that Tesla can actually be one of the biggest, if not the biggest way to get more tips when it comes to driving.